It's not calling you Josh Frydenberg, it's calling you Dosh Frydenberg.
Under the coalition, taxes for hard-working Australians will always be lower.
You know, I don't hold a hose, mate, and I don't sit in your control room.
They're answers that only can come from Victoria, I'm afraid, because that's not my job.
But I ain't spending any time, though, because in the meantime, every 3 months, a person is torn to pieces by a crocodile in North Queensland.
Well, g'day, listeners, and welcome to Hard Hats and High Viz. I think we're on week 23, Jack. They said we'd never make it, but here we are. And we've got all political, social and media and sporting stories from around Australia to cover today. And joining me, as usual, is Hong Kong Jack. Happy birthday, Jack.
Thank you very much. 67?
67. It's not quite dinner for two.
No. It's ticking them over, though, you know.
Ticking them over. And I believe in honour of this momentous event, there's a public holiday in Hong Kong. Well, one of many. Yeah,
it's one of many. I thought it was appropriate that they should declare a public holiday for my 67th birthday. But Absolutely. It's also Autumn Moon Festival, which is...
the pubs will be open all night, by the way, yeah.
Which means that it's meant to mean kind of the end of summer. The humidity's supposed to start dropping from tomorrow on, but it doesn't quite work like that.
Yeah, no, look, climate doesn't quite follow the calendar. But, look, happy birthday. I hope you come to the show full of celebration and joy. Of course, as we covered in our Around the World show last Friday, the Queen is dead. Long live the King. Charles III is our new head of state in Australia. And we're getting absolute wall-to-wall coverage in the media at the moment, to the point, I think, of some frustration for some people. But there was some media reports of note to cover yesterday, including proclamations being read out in all state and territory parliaments, on the steps of our parliaments, to sizable crowds. Wanting to get a moment in history. The proclamation, of course, was to announce that our new head of state, our new monarch, the King of Australia, is Charles III.
Well, it's been getting a lot of coverage around the world, and that's because people are interested in it. I think there's no problem with the wall-to-wall coverage, because I think people want to watch it.
Oh, look, there's a very serious aspect of just being part of history, regardless of what your views may be on the monarchy. That as we said last Friday, the common figure in our lives in terms of political leadership was Queen Elizabeth II. I mean, she was crowned 10 years after my birth, and she was just that. She's always been there, and now, of course, she's gone and will be replaced by her son, her oldest son, who people have got to know quite a lot. I mean, he was educated at Timbertop School at Geelong College, I believe.
Geelong Grammar, actually.
Geelong Grammar. Yeah. I always get them mixed up. And he was educated here briefly in Australia, and has been to Australia on many, many occasions. And it's almost like we sort of know the fellow. There was a bit of media yesterday before he made his speech, his televised speech. There were various minions hanging around, putting things on the desk. Did you see that? He was sort of sending them, dispatching them off. Minion.
Yeah,
get rid of this.
He did kind of hiss at the aide to get a little pen holder off the desk. It wasn't a great moment, and that's gone all around the world, I've got to say. I'm sure the Queen Consort will be taking him aside and saying, "Not so much of that, thanks, darling," because it didn't look good, and it made the front page of papers. It made the front page of the New York Post. So, you know,
he's going to rule with love, but it seems like it's a hard love, Jack. It's a hard love. I was particularly amused to see that there is a person, presumably not his sole job, but something of a valet, who squeezes toothpaste onto the royal toothbrush in Charles' case, and also irons his shoelaces.
Yes, I read that as well. I was just hoping that squeezing the toothpaste onto the toothbrush was not a euphemism.
Yeah, it can be. It might have been. In fact, that's what people suggested when I tweeted that up. And I said that basically I wasn't prepared to accept Charles as our new head of state. But then I noticed his freshly ironed shoelaces and I thought, gee, that's impressive. The Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, will be in attendance at the royal funeral, the funeral of Elizabeth II. And in comments today, as we record on the 12th of September, he has said that there will be no referendum on the Republic, that the voice, that is the Uluru Statement voice and processes, will come first and the Republic comes next.
Yes, I think that's wise.
It did lead to a lot of, look, if you'd taken Lydia Thorpe as your best behaved green on your bingo card last week, Jack, congratulations, you've had an unlikely win because...
Would have been good odds.
No. Yes, you'd prefer not to win it on the bingo card. You'd like to take it with the bookies. But she was, in fact, because Adam Bant, within hours, literally hours of the Queen's death, piped up saying that it was time Australia became a republic. And that was followed by a tweet from Maureen Faruqi, Greens New South Wales Senator, who said she couldn't, and I quote, mourn the leader of a racist empire built on stolen lives, land and wealth of colonised people. We are reminded of the urgency of treaty with First Nations, justice and reparations for British colonies and becoming a republic. Before I ask for your comment on that, Jack, that is a further indication that the Greens are not willing to follow the processes put together by Australia's Indigenous leadership that say voice first, treaty second. So that's another indication that Maureen Faruqi's on the side of Lydia Thorpe when we really just don't know what the Greens' position is going to be. All over the shop at the moment. But yes, but her comments on the racist empire, probably a little bit too soon, Jack?
Well, there are people all around the world who are running similar lines to this. And really what they want is to be taken a bit of notice of. Right. It's just a kind of a cry for help. Please take some notice of me.
That's pretty much how the Greens operate, isn't it?
Yeah,
yeah. Look at me over here. I don't want to be irrelevant.
Yeah, there was a university professor from, I think it's Carnegie Mellon University in the US, who won the prize on this because she went a step further, and this is before the Queen had actually died, and she went a step further and hoped that the Queen would die in excruciating pain on account of colonialism.
Isn't that lovely?
Yeah, so very lovely. Even not even Twitter could stand that. They've sacked her from Twitter, so that's pretty bad. Because Twitter will put up almost anything from the left, so they couldn't stand it. But yeah, look, it's just a bit pathetic, really.
It begs the question. How many generations do we have to go through before the business of, let's say, slavery and colonialism expires? Elizabeth was a very young queen in 1952. Slavery had been abolished in the UK or Great Britain in the early 19th century. And while there may be members of her family, ancestral, who did benefit from slavery and colonialism, where's the cutoff on this? Is there no cutoff?
It doesn't seem to be, does there? I actually decouple colonialism and slavery. Slavery still exists today. It's just done by coloured people to other coloured people. So we're supposed to ignore that. But colonialism and slavery aren't the same thing. you look around, and particularly British colonialism, and they left a pretty good legacy almost everywhere they went. You look at the successful countries in the world today, the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, all successful countries, and they all were British colonies. Yeah, and you look at Asia and you say three of the great cities of Asia are Mumbai, Singapore, and Hong Kong. British cities, really.
Yeah, I guess that's not to ignore the fact that, there were terrible excesses that went on through colonial periods. I mean, the great moment of British shame really should fall in Jamaica. There are others, of course.
Yep.
But essentially what you're saying is that what the British left were structures for the management of countries as they moved into independence. That is, independent courts, separation of powers, elected parliaments, and those sorts of institutions have held countries who have gone through independence in Africa, in the Caribbean, throughout the world, have held them in fairly good stead.
They had. They left the building blocks for human rights. And this is true around the world. Wherever you have these things, the human rights situation is not too bad. The rule of law, some kind of representative government, a free press or free-ish press, and a decent private property system. And the Brits left that wherever they go. If you ask yourself, why is Malaysia so much better off than Indonesia? And the difference is that the Indonesians got the Dutch and the Malaysians got the Brits.
Yes, it really, that's the shadow of colonialism, and we could talk about neo-colonialism too, but the shadow of colonialism is, if you're in Zaire or what is now the DRC, and you're unlucky enough to have the Belgians
yes.
oversee your country in terrible ways.
The Belgians or the Portuguese. If you got those, you were in trouble. But if you got the Brits, that was the best thing that could happen to you.
Yeah, and that's not to say that it was good, that it was all fine and dandy, but that's to say that it was better, generally speaking, than, let's say, the Portuguese in South America, the Belgians in the Congo, and the Dutch in Indonesia.
The other thing to note, get the death of the
Queen. Or the
Queen.
Germans in New Guinea, Jack.
Yeah, well, that's right. The death of the Queen, one of her great achievements, in my view, was that she really kicked off the Commonwealth of Nations in 1953, a year after she became Queen. She really kicked that off, and that's a huge success. There are 56 countries in the Commonwealth now. I think only 14 of them have her as head of state. So a lot of them have become republics, but they're still in the Commonwealth. Not only are nearly all of the ex-British colonies in the Commonwealth, but there are countries like Gabon and Mozambique and Rwanda who had nothing to do with British colonialism, who have applied for and been accepted and are now members of the Commonwealth. They want to be in it.
Yeah, it's a really interesting element that that the countries with no background in British colonialism have opted to join. I guess what you might say as a union of nations that have, with the exception of them, that one thing in common: they were former British colonies.
Yep.
All right. Now, of course, we can't talk about Maureen Faruqi without talking about Pauline Hanson. I mean, we mentioned Faruqi's comments. Pauline Hanson said she should basically pack her bags and go back to Pakistan. We don't need to comment any further than that, except to say, Jack, that Pakistan was in fact a former British colony as part of British India, of course.
It was. She never lets you down, Pauline, does she?
She certainly doesn't. But over to genuine political leadership and Albanese. her Prime Minister Albanese, who said this morning, I made it clear, actually he said this yesterday, I do apologise, I made it clear before the last election what our intention was during this term. That is the recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait people in our Constitution. I said at the time I couldn't envisage a circumstance where we changed our head of state to an Australian head of state, but still didn't recognise First Nations people in our Constitution. And the fact that we live with the oldest continuous culture on earth, so that's our priorities this term. I made that very clear before the election. It seems he's got it right again. In terms of just tapping into the national mood, I think that's right.
I don't think there's any burning desire to change the head of state situation. I think there is a desire to get something right with Indigenous recognition. I'm still not absolutely convinced that the pathway they've chosen to go down is the right way to go about that. And put it this way, I think they've got a hell of a lot of work to do to get the voice up as it currently
I fully
is.
accept that, but what I'm saying is that the Faroukis and the Adam Bants of this world are very much in the minority on that particular question, on the particular question of the Republic at this time. That this is really not the time. I mean, it's okay to discuss it, but for our political leadership to be discussing it, it is clearly not the right time. Might I suggest, Jack, that the arguments for a republic might grow the longer we get into Charles III's reign?
That could well be the case. He's certainly, as Prince of Wales, he had a sketchy idea of the separation of powers. He was a bit inclined to be jumping in and wanting to let everybody know what his political views were, and that is not a good plan.
No, it can't be. I mean, we talked about the history of this. Elizabeth's uncle, Edward VIII, in his brief reign before he abdicated, he was basically refusing to accept the advice of the government of the day at a particularly intense period. Just as on the preliminary years before World War II, and it could have been disastrous. And I think, as you suggested last week, it was with a sense of relief that he abdicated. So these things, and it doesn't make the monarch a rubber stamp, does it? It allows the monarch to ask questions of the government about the advice that he or she is receiving, in this case, Prince Charles III. And I did note today that Prime Minister Albanese has said that King Charles III should be making his views clear about climate change. But I suspect they will be tempered going forward.
Well, I suspect Prime Minister Albanese saying that because he thinks that Prince Charles' views on climate change accord with his. The problem with this is they don't accord with everybody's. And what happens when he starts saying things that, say, Prime Minister Albanese doesn't agree with? In 70 years on the throne, one of the great geniuses of her reign was that we really didn't know what the Queen's opinions were, and that's the proper way. That's the proper way to go about it. There's really only one occasion where it's pretty widely accepted that we knew that she was at odds with her government, and that was during the prime ministership of Margaret Thatcher, and she made it plain she disagreed with Margaret Thatcher because Margaret Thatcher didn't want to have sanctions against South Africa in an attempt to end apartheid.
Yes.
So that's the only known occasion where we know that she was at odds with her government. And over 70 years, that's the proper record to have.
I don't know if you've seen or read the statement by former Prime Minister Paul Keating, Jack, but it was a rather lovely thing. It's not too long, but I won't read it all. He refers to her sense of public duty, that she attached herself to the public good against what she recognised as a tidal wave of private interest and private reward, and she did this for a lifetime, never deviating. And he goes on to say, and I think this is a wonderful point, in a 70-year reign, she was required to meet literally hundreds of thousands of officials, presidents, prime ministers, ministers, premiers, mayors and municipal personalities. It was more than one person should ever have been asked to do. And I think that's a really good point to make. But he says Elizabeth II's stoicism and moralism welded her to the task, and with it the idea of monarchy. Her exceptionally long, dedicated reign is unlikely to be repeated, not only in Britain but in the world generally. But with her passing, her example of public service remains with us as a lesson in dedication to a lifelong mission in what she saw as the value of what is both enduringly good and right. So that comes from an old rusted-on Republican, Jack.
Who indeed had told her that had he survived longer as Prime Minister, he was going to have a referendum on the Republic, but he didn't survive that long.
He was the Lizard of Oz, Jack. You remember?
He was.
He placed an indelicate hand at the back of Queen Elizabeth while I think she was in the UK. While he was in the UK. And this led to him in the red tops being described as the Lizard of Oz.
He was indeed. Actually, if you want to, Prince Charles should have a listen to this. What I call just about Boris Johnson's finest moment as an ex-Prime Minister. He made a speech in the Commons, and 8 minutes, and it's well worth the watch on YouTube. You'll find it easily enough. And he pointed out that what she did in that 70 years was to be the one person in the country who was above the political fray and above commercial interest, that she stood above all of that. And that's what Charles has got to do if he's going to be a success. And if he's not a success, the move for republics all around the Commonwealth, all around the remaining 14 countries will gain speed.
Yes, indeed. Canada and Australia would be the next cabs off the rank. But in Australia, it would seem not in the term of this government would we be looking at a referendum. But I want to ask or set out to our listeners where the Australian Republican movement is now in terms of a model for a republic and a head of state. And this, of course, caused major ructions with the referendum back in the 90s because the Republican movement couldn't settle on a model that they thought was workable. Some people believed in the election of a president. Others believed in a parliamentary appointment by 2/3 majority. And seems like the Republican movement has sought to address this by what they call the Australian choice model, which will allow every state and territory parliament to nominate one candidate for election to be our head of state, and the federal parliament will be able to nominate up to 3. We will then hold a national election for Australians to decide which candidate should be head of state. So everyone will get to vote on it. What's that? How do you see that as a model, Jack?
I don't think it'll hold up.
Yeah, why?
Well, I think the same problem remains. Australia's kind of split more or less 3 ways, about 30%, a little bit under 30% support for retaining a constitutional monarchy, a 30% split for a minimalist model that is simply replacing the Governor-General with a president, and 30% for an elected model, that is where we all vote to have a president and vote on who the president is. And I think that split remains much the same. And while that split remains the same, we won't have a republic.
Yeah, I mean, they've tried to address this by saying, you will have a list of, what have we got, 6, 7, so there'll be 10. There'll be a list of 10 candidates, Jack. It'll be like voting for The Voice. To see, and you know that the states are going to throw up their own likely people. So that could be a bit of a nightmare in itself when you're talking about getting a majority for Tasmania or South Australia, for example. I don't know why we don't just give it to Jimmy Barnes and just get on with it.
Yeah.
The Republican movement says that the president would act as a Governor-General, take advice from the government of the day, so the role itself would not change, and under the model could be removed by parliamentary vote in the case of proven misbehaviour or incapacity. So we're talking about, 23rd Amendment sort of stuff, Jack. I think it's 23rd Amendment, where presidents may be punted due to being droolingly insane. Never been practiced, of course. A republic would require significant constitutional amendment, not all of it that would be subject to a referendum. The referendum would take a sort of single question approach, I imagine. But here's something that caught my eye today, Jack. The Australian Republican movement proposes the incorporation of gender-neutral language throughout the Constitution, which is dominated by he's. So he, she, him. Man, we start having all those pronoun problems.
My recollection of the law on this is a little bit shaky, but I think all of the states and the federal government have what they call Acts Interpretation Acts, which already cover this. It generally says something like any reference to he means he or she, et cetera, et cetera.
Universal, yes.
Yeah.
No, I just found that to be a nice little point of trivia there, and there's almost a column in that.
I think there probably is. Yeah,
it was news to me.
Besides, it'll give you an opportunity to have a free swing at Peter Fitzsimons, which is always fun.
And that was my next point, Jack. The role of Peter Fitzsimons, who's the AM chair, the Republican movement chair. He is a divisive character, and I suggest that is perhaps not where we want to be, not the sort of leadership we would require.
Well, he's a divisive character because he is so certain that he is right on every occasion, and he's intolerant of anybody else who has a view or who's not as modern as he is, who hasn't caught up with his opinions on things. So that's not calculated, in my view, to swing people in behind his movement.
Look, I did look at the committee there, and look, I'm happy to say it. I'm an avowed Republican, and I actually support the election of a head of state. But when I looked at the ARM committee, I'd have to say, Jack, without being unkind to any of them, that we're not talking about the nation's best and brightest. Well, I guess I am being unkind.
We're probably not. I mean, the thing with a divisive character like Fitzsimons is he's good at talking to the already converted. But what he's not good at is taking people who are neutral or perhaps have a different view and calmly explaining a point of view that they may come to agree with.
Yeah, it's that ability to persuade that I would say he just does not have that talent. Where would you go? Can you name one or two who might be better? Malcolm Turnbull, perhaps. I know he's had a crack. He'd be a veteran, but he is a very eloquent fellow.
He's a possible. I suppose that's true. He's a possible.
Kevin Rudd, possibly another avowed Republican. Yeah.
Don't think so. Yeah.
Well, I'm talking about the ability to communicate and them being popular people. I mean, Kevin Rudd remains, a high level of popularity, among those people who haven't met him. But that's what you need. That you need people in the political sphere. They can't be entertainers, actors. With the exception of Jimmy Barnes, of course. They can't be entertainers, actors, those sorts of people because they're too quickly derided. They need to be political figures with the ability to persuade people who might be on the fence or hold a different view.
It's much more likely to happen if there is a political leader from the conservative side of politics who takes this view.
Yeah, that's why I come up with Malcolm Turnbull. Although
there's plenty of people on the conservative side of politics who don't believe he ever belonged on the conservative side of politics. That's the weakness of Malcolm in that regard. If John Howard could be persuaded to change his mind, he'd be the ideal person. But he's not.
Yeah, look, I can't see that happening, Jack. No. Either. John Howard's been a constitutional monarchist since he was 2, and he's not about to change anytime soon. All right. So look, this I suggest to wrap this discussion up. The best way to approach this is in a year or more. that's when you get underway with promoting and educating. Of course, we do have an assistant minister for the Republic, Matt Thistlethwaite, who's actually a pretty talented politician. I suggest he go very quiet on this for a while, Jack, and then we wait and see what happens with the new monarch, and then the nation can have a conversation.
That'd be a great job being Assistant Minister for the Republic. I mean, you should just sit back and do nothing for a couple of years, you know. Yeah, no, very busy, Matt, boss. You know?
Matt, go and have a look at some republics around the world.
Yeah.
And, you know, fact-finding, all that sort of stuff. Yeah, could be a very, very good job for Matt there for a little while, not having to do very much at all. In fact, Elbows just told him, don't do anything for a little while. Yeah. So, yes, he'll be able to put the feet up in the office there. Stephen Rice is one hell of a journalist and a good friend of mine in today's Oz, has reported that the $1 billion a year golden ticket, that's perhaps a nickname for the visa scheme, will be axed. Now, the golden ticket visa scheme, and correct me if I'm wrong, Jack, because this is your bailiwick. If you come to the country with $5 million in cash and assets, you can qualify as a significant investor, and there's a special visa, and you've got to bring $5 million minimum into the country.
And there's no, unlike most visas coming into Australia, there's no age limit, so you can be 75 if you want, you know.
Right, okay. Not a single applicant in the past 10 years has been rejected under the character test, which is something Stephen's been working on. So if you've got $5 million, it really doesn't matter what your background is, or so it would appear. But if you've got $5 million or more, you come in and you get a bit of red carpet treatment.
Seems perfectly fair to me. Everyone knows that people with $5 million have got impeccable character.
Exactly right. Yes, they've got 5 million very good reasons to be of good character. But of course, that's not right. I mean, you've got organised crime figures and so forth who can come into the country, and it would seem that over the period we've had more than 7,000 citizens from one particular part of the world, where there are a lot of people, and not one of them has been rejected under the character test. So that seems to be a good thing that we get rid of this. But it is something that a lot of countries around the world do embrace. You know, bring your cash and you can come on in.
Yeah, they're generally called golden visas or some variation on that. But just a quick run through: Cyprus, Malta, UK, Canada, Spain, Italy, Greece, Austria, Belgium, US, Ireland, Grenada, Antigua and Barbuda, Turkey, St Kitts, Dominica.
St Kitts and Nevis, I'm sure about that.
Yes. Vanuatu, Montenegro. They all have, that's just a quick, from my memory pretty much, a quick run through of other countries who have a similar kind of visas. And there's nothing wrong with the idea. You've just got to run it properly. And personally, I don't think it's been run very well in Australia. It was run by the Home Affairs or Immigration Department, but the Department of Trade Foreign Affairs and Trade have stuck their nose in for a while.
Yeah, that's right. They do overlap a lot, don't they, in immigration matters, yeah.
And there were tricky things. You talk about the 7,000 Chinese. There were tricky things about in the way that the significant investor visa works, is that you're supposed to look back and say, well, where did the money come from? And when you're dealing with Chinese applicants who've got plenty of money, well, the reality is none of them had any money, or their family didn't have any money in 1979 because there was no money. Before the opening up of China, all the money that's around, splashing around, that can be used for these sort of visas was made after 1979, or generally well after 1979. So, and it wasn't all made in under Marquess of Queensberry rules. Let's put it that way. Yeah.
Yes, it's a very good point. Look, I can tell you that Cyprus is a major centre now for Russian oligarchs establishing themselves there, and organised crime figures as well in Cyprus. You mentioned Antigua and Barbuda. You mentioned St Kitts and Nevis. It's very prominent in the Caribbean the Caribbean, and this is a knock-on effect of essentially of the UK joining the common market back in the early 1970s, is that all of a sudden these islands who had their sugar crop that was routinely snaffled by the UK, taken away, was just basically that's how their economies functioned. Grow the sugar, sell the sugar, and keep moving along. And then when the UK joined the common market, a requirement of the common market was that the UK would have to source its sugar from elsewhere. So that immediately obliterated these economies, small island economies in the Caribbean. And that led them to say, well, what are we good at? Well, we're good at tourism. And then you think, well, tourism can fluctuate depending on, bad weather and all sorts of issues. So some of them, and St Kitts and Nevis was the first of the countries, determined that they would have an economic citizenship program. So that basically means that you would either invest in property that was approved by the government, or that you would come into the country with a significant amount of folding stuff and be granted citizenship. In fact, you didn't actually have to come into the country, Jack. You could have just invested in the country and be granted citizenship.
Yes, that's still the case. Certainly it's true of Cyprus that they are a landing spot for Russian organised crime, but they're not the only country where that's the case. I mean, if you go to Thailand these days, you can't move for Russian crooks, but.
Well, I'd say that if you look at Monaco, Jack, there are more Russians there than there are Monegasques. I mean, basically you have to basically push Russians out of the way to find a local.
Yeah. Generally speaking, I actually don't think there's a problem with having one of these golden visas in your country. I just think it's got to be better run than the Australian one has been up until to date. And more generally speaking, the minister, what's her name? Claire O'Neill.
Yes.
Has announced that they're going to look at the whole visa processing system because it's become too slow, too complicated, and it's made Australia a less attractive destination for migrants. Yes. There, potential migrants, and I know this from Hong Kong, potential migrants are looking at where they might move to and deciding, look, Australia's just a bit hard.
Just getting a bit too hard. It has had I wrote about this last week, it has had the sort of skull and crossbones on the borders for some time, metaphorically speaking. And now we have people who've just recently, Australian citizens who've recently applied for passports, although that's a DFAT matter, will know that there are significant delays in getting them. And then imagine, so let's say, Jack, a student from Hong Kong wants to study and work in Australia. How long would that take for that visa to be processed?
Well,
as an average,
the student visas come through relatively quickly because they're really quite easy to get. The skilled migration stuff can just take too long. It can take a year. That just makes Australia uncompetitive, and that's just it's really a question of getting the process right. And Claire O'Neill, I think she looks pretty promising as a minister, I've got to say. She's an ex-McKinsey type, and they're normally reasonably smart. And she won a Fulbright scholarship to Harvard to the Master of Public Policy. And like you, she's from the publishing empire. Her mum was Anne O'Donovan, who you probably knew from the publishing days.
Yes. Well, yeah, I didn't know her, but she's a significant figure in publishing. What about decoupling immigration from home affairs, Jack? I mean,
I think that needs to happen.
Yeah, it just seems to me that now that we've got this super ministry that was created for no good reason other than to satisfy Peter Dutton
to sell some black shirts
and crank out a few medals. It just seems to me now that we have the sort of home affairs, the black shirt border force squad, most of them are just ex-customs guys, is sending a message to the rest of the world. And with the rest of the world has a limited, skilled and talent pool. And we need to get into that. And we can't really have we can't really have these kinds of impediments, even if they are metaphorical or symbolic.
Australia's had one of the best run migration schemes, for 20 years. And it enjoys much wider support locally, like as in Australia, than most immigration schemes do in their own countries. So the basics of the scheme are quite good. It's just not been particularly well run. The processing's not been good enough. All that needs to change. And in my view, decoupling home affairs from immigration would be a step in the right direction. Getting back to having specialist migration people running the show.
Absolutely right, Jack. We couldn't agree more on that. And on your birthday too. In fact, that is exactly what I wrote in my column last week. For our New South Wales listeners and others just generally interested in politics, there was a Guardian Essential poll published today, a very small sample, by the way, but trying to determine an outcome in the state election, which is not going to occur until March 25, 2023. Only 661 respondents in the Essential poll. The Essential company does very good work, but that is a very small number. So you've got a margin of error there that would be hellishly large. But it showed that 36.4 would put the coalition first on their ballot, and Labor 32. With preferences, and this is always where polls start falling over, it shows as a prospect of a hung parliament looms. Well, polls suggest hung parliaments all the time, but they very rarely happen. But it's what it's showing is a decline in support for the coalition, but perhaps not as bad as some people might have thought.
Yeah, I would have thought they were in a lot of trouble, but on those figures, maybe they can hang on. But as you say, the poll's a very small one, margin very high. My view of it is that Labor leader Chris Minns is the best thing that they've put up the best fellow they've put up for a while.
Yeah, he's good. He's good. There's no doubt about it. He
looks pretty promising.
He does look the goods.
Saw a nice little video of him yesterday teaching his little fella how to ride a bike in a park.
Okay. Yeah, nice little bit of fluff there for his Facebook page and what have you. But look, those numbers, I guess what it does do is confirm, what are we at there? 69% of voters will vote for one or the other of the two major parties. And that is very much in line with federal and state polling or actual results in state elections and federal elections going back for a little while now.
Yeah, and that means the other 30% are going to decide who wins the election.
Yeah, and that's pretty much it. So, I mean, people will vote tactically. It's probably good news for the Greens. It might be good news. It's not good news for the UAP, Jack, because they just deregistered. They just deregistered their name, and there are all sorts of constitutional electoral experts who are coming forward saying, I don't think they can re-register before the next federal election under that name. They can call themselves something else. And that was very amusing because they do have a senator, a UAP senator, and he didn't have a clue that the UAP no longer exists, although he can continue to use the name in the Senate because they don't rely on the registration or deregistration of political party names. Very, very strange stuff from Clive. He's up to something, Jack.
Yeah, the minor parties are always a source of great amusement.
It was really funny. He was interviewed, and this is Babbitt, Senator Babbitt. He was interviewed in The Age, and they said, "Oh, do you know that your party's been registered?" He said, "Oh, that's not happening. You can't be serious," and all that stuff. And they said, "Well, just go and have a look." And he said, "Just 1 minute." And he came back and goes, "Oh, yeah, we have done that. I'd forgotten." It was a lovely moment, which we'll be covering in the conditional release program very, very soon. Look, a lot of this remains to be seen. What we are seeing at the moment in New South Wales, Jack, is we're going through a process, an independent investigation into parliamentary standards in regard to the prospect of bullying, harassment, sexual harassment, that sort of thing. And there is some concern about it because it effectively gives people a free hit. You know, people who might be disgruntled with their bosses, who might be elected representatives, can come forward and take a bit of a slap back. And it's really gone all over the place. There are allegations against Greens MPs, Labor MPs, and of course in the coalition.
Mm. Yeah, well, there's never any shortage of the less than gruntled in politics. So that's why these inquiries are generally a bad idea.
Yeah, look, it just depends on how they take evidence, though. And what's been criticised about this investigation is that there is no ability to cross-examine or test the claims of those coming forward. And I think there is an issue there in terms of just natural justice.
I think that's right. Yeah.
Yes. All right. Now, look, just in my particular part of the world, are very close to it there, and many people around the country will have heard of this. There was a car crash just outside of Buxton, about 100k south of Sydney, with 5 dead teenagers driven into one car, aged between 14 and 16. Terrible tragedy. And the 18-year-old driver, his name is Tyrrell Edwards, has been remanded in custody. He was a P-plate driver. He had a bit of a history of speeding and having lost his licence, and he was driving with a 4-door cabin, and all 5 passengers, it would seem, were not secured by seatbelts, and the truck hit a tree. And it's just a terrible piece of news. This is sort of close enough to me to have that sort of ripple effect where there is sort of profound shock where I am in this particular part of the world known as the Southern Highlands. And one of the comments from one of the children was, look, not one of the victims, obviously, but one of their friends was, look, it's the Southern Highlands and there's nothing to do. And that is nothing else to do. They were going on a Macca's run. The six kids, including the 18-year-old driver. And he was it would seem, going a bit too fast. They weren't secured in the vehicle with seatbelts, and it's led to this terrible tragedy. And it's led to a discussion about what can be done. Jack, I know some states limit the number of drivers that a P-plater can take, a number of passengers that a driver on green P-plates in New South Wales, which means you're 1 or 2 years out from getting your licence. Possibly something like that. I mean, in the end, what we're dealing with, I mean, Tyrrell Edwards is a young kid whose life will be ruined by this, and he's almost certain to get a custodial sentence, and a fairly significant one. He's been charged with 5 counts of dangerous driving occasioning death. What can be done? I mean, young people think they're bulletproof. That's the first thing. The second thing is these country towns, there's not a lot going on. And this accident actually occurred, and I think it was a Tuesday night.
Yeah, well, I grew up in country towns, rural towns in Victoria. Anyone who's my age who grew up in those sort of country towns will be able to sit back today and think about it and remember 4, 5, 6, 7 young people who you knew who didn't make it through to 30 or so. And
this in the days, so not to put too fine a point on it, Jack, the cars were pretty ordinary. The roads were often appalling. Very little signage on the road or on the side of it. But it still tells us this event. It still tells us that these multiple tragedies can occur on our roads.
Good thing is it happens a hell of a lot less than it used to.
That's true.
But some of the things you're suggesting, I think, are good ideas, but there's only so much you can do because young people love to be idiots.
Well,
I mean, it's great fun.
You and I would have gone through that. I remember sitting in the back of a ute going down a freeway at 100 kilometres an hour. You know, I mean, just nutty stuff. You look back, you get the chills. But you know, that's just sort of the way things are when you're 18, 19. You just think nothing's going to happen. There'll be no consequences. Yeah, I did enjoy like to hear anyway. There's nothing very good about any of this, but one of the parents of one of the 5 teenage victims has come forward and said immediately, actually, that he did not blame the driver, and he immediately understood that this was a terrible tragedy that really could have occurred to any one of us at any stage in the junction along the journey when we've sort of done reckless things.
Yeah,
terrible tragedy. Yeah. It has captured the nation, and it's sent really sort of ripples around the place, and people are absolutely devastated in my part of the world. I don't know that there are too many answers to it other than making cars safer, making roads better, and some of them are pretty awful around this part of the world with all the rain we've had, and trying to impress upon kids that they are not bulletproof.
Mm.
All right. Now moving on to much lighter and more enjoyable topics in sport, Jack. We are in the AFL in particular now. We are down to 4. The Swans will play the Pies at the SCG after Collingwood knocked over Fremantle fairly convincingly, and the Cats will play Brisbane at the MCG. And the man who was making headlines for all the wrong reasons, Jordan Agoe, for Collingwood midfielder and goal kicker, is making them for all the right ones now. He was definitely best on ground in the semi on what was that, Saturday.
He wasn't too far off of the week before either.
Yeah, he's a hard-body midfielder, so he wins a lot of footy. He's highly skilled, and he can do the bash and crash stuff, and then be a very good user at the end of it.
It's a reminder, isn't it, that sport just can't be for the choir boys and the choir girls. There's got to be a place in a sport like AFL for the blokes who are a bit of a rat bag. I mean,
I think he's more than a bit of a rat bag. He's a card-carrying member of the rat bag club.
Yeah, but that's fine. There's got to be a place in sport for a bloke like that as well.
Yeah, well, look, and they're playing against a club this weekend at the SCG, playing against Sydney Swans, who famously have a no dickheads policy, Jack.
Which I never thought meant that no dickheads could play there. You know, there's a couple who played there who I thought qualified pretty well, actually.
But they don't behave like dickheads. I think that's the thing. I mean, it's a lot of. I mean, when we talk about the environment in Sydney, there are only 2 clubs in Sydney, and the other one really don't get a lot of press. So there's really just you don't live in that goldfish bowl existence that the Melbourne clubs do. No, and unlike Collingwood, Sydney don't seem to have their own resident tattooist. Yeah, they got a few tats, but yeah, the boys from Collingwood got a lot of ink on the arms, and it's almost like you sort of see one who doesn't. And I think Scott Pendlebury doesn't have any ink that I know of, or is it immediately visible? But you think, gee whiz, when's his turn? No, look, both games should be belters. Brisbane really did bounce back. After a pretty ordinary run into the finals. They were probably a bit lucky to beat Richmond in the first elimination final, but then bounced back and did a very good job in the second half against Melbourne, who were the reigning premiers. Bumped them out.
Yeah, noticeably with Melbourne, they stop.
They play in spurts, and if you can win the contested footy and break even at clearances, then you got them, because they don't have the best forward line running around. I'd suggest that the big problem for Brisbane will be whether Jared Berry will play or not. He has been offered I think a 1-match suspension, and he will go to the tribunal. And that is in regards to some. Well, the AFL grades it as intentional contact to the face in regard to an incident, and brings up the issue of gouging against Clayton Oliver when they had a bit of a skirmish on the ground in the third quarter. They might get away with it, but the tribunal tends to be fairly forgiving during the final series, but they need him. If they don't have him, I can't see them beating the Cats.
Should be 2 good games anyway.
Yeah, all right. In the NRL, the Roosters were sent packing in a spiteful game. It's the Sydney Derby, NRL Sydney Derby, Roosters and Rabbitohs, and multiple send-offs. The Rabbitohs got the chocolates, but Thomas Burgess is facing a 2-match suspension for a high tackle on James Tedesco, and he'll have to spend some time at the judiciary to see if he's allowed to play. An ex-Rooster, Mitchell Latrell, was a hero scoring when the Bunnies had 11 on the field. It had a couple sent off, yellow card, very, very a very, very nasty little game there, and I can't see Burgess getting off the contact with Tedesco, which basically subbed out probably the best player in the competition, subbed him out with concussion.
Yeah, I just saw some highlights. It certainly looked like a pretty rugged encounter.
This is why we love the NRL this time of year, Jack. It does get pretty willing. The Melbourne Storm got taken out. I watched that game. They got beaten by the Raiders. Sort of end of an era. It seemed like it was the end of an era, particularly with their half probably being traded in 2024. It just looked to be the end of an era. They don't often lose at home, but the Raiders, who just snuck into the finals, gave them a bit of a touch-up. And in probably in terms of just the sheer, great to watch rugby league. The Sharks were beaten by the Cowboys, who came from behind to beat them 32-30. And there's a lot to like about the Cowboys too. So the Panthers will have the week off, as will the Cowboys. Sharks will play the Bunnies and Eels will play the Raiders. And the Panthers do look to be head and shoulders the best side in the competition. Gave the Eels a touch-up. That's one game we didn't mention. They've been the best side all year. And
they have.
And
by a margin.
And meanwhile, in cricket, Jack, Aaron Finch has had a Clayton's retirement. He's retired from the ODI, but he's still going to be in the T20 side. It's a bit odd.
He better make a run or two.
I reckon he's made about 20 in the last 10 knocks. He got knocked over for 5 in the dead rubber in Cairns yesterday with Stephen Smith making 105. And the Kiwis, well, they loomed, but their batting's a bit fragile. I think the Black Caps have come into this series. It's all over now, just the 3 ODIs, but they'd come in with some games against Holland, and I think one of the other sort of second grade nations, and so they looked a bit unprepared. They've got problems with their batting, the Black Caps, and they've got 2 in Latham and Williamson. They've got 2 guys who are batting 3 and 4, who are accumulators, and they need a blaster. They need a blaster in there to knock the ball around a bit. But it also, this series has just confirmed why Adam Zampa is probably, or certainly, Australia's best slow bowler, and probably the premium leg spinner in the world. Yeah, he's certainly up there anyway. Very, very good player.
He looks pretty good.
All right. And meanwhile, Jack, the Wallabies play the All Blacks this Thursday night at Marvel Stadium in Melbourne. And they're playing for the Bledisloe Cup, as they do. But they're also in the Rugby Championship, with New Zealand currently on top with 10, and South Africa, Australia and Argentina all a point behind, with 2 matches remaining in a competition that no team has managed to dominate. So someone will hold up that big trophy, and as well as the Bledisloe Cup. Well, if the All Blacks do win. What chance the Wallabies got against the OBs, Jack?
Well, neither of them are going very well, so they've got a chance. I bumped into a Kiwi pal yesterday, and he said, "Well, why is it on a Thursday night?" And I said, "Well, my guess is that the ARU are thinking about do they want to finish a distant third in the television ratings behind the NRL and the AFL, and if they play it on a weekend?
They can't play it on the Friday or the Saturday night, no.
Yeah.
That's just going to be a clash. And yeah, no, that's very sensible. And then, look, they'll get a big crowd in Melbourne. There's a lot of rugby union followers down in Melbourne.
Yep.
And it'll be interesting to see. I'm not quite sure that Marvel Stadium is purpose built for the for rugby of any stripe, or soccer indeed for that matter, because it's an oval. But it is a ground with a retractable roof. So that means the surface will be pretty good. Look, for me, Jack, the All Blacks, didn't they just hand out a pasting to the Pumas in their last hit out after a few losses? So they might have just run themselves into form there. All right, so we've got some fantastic footy and sport, and footy in particular coming up. And the cricket, I think Australia have got 3 ODIs against India coming up. So that'll be worth the price of admission there. Aaron Finch, of course, won't be there. And I'd imagine even Stephen Smith will captain that side with the prospect of the big show taking it on as well. Bocce's become a very handy bowler on top of his entertaining batting.
Yeah, I thought they should have persisted with him as a test player as well myself.
He's still keen, mate. He's still keen. Yeah. His off-spin bowling now is better than it has been. He's very good all-round cricketer. I mean, he's probably the best fieldsman in the world. But his off-spin has really taken a step up. All right, well, that's it from Hard Hats and High Vis for week 22.
Well, except that I think we should give Louise Milligan
really?
a round of applause today.
Yeah.
She told
ethics and journalism sort of stuff, Jack.
I think it was the Melbourne Writers' Festival,
right?
And she said that reporters and media outlets must correct any error that they make.
Yeah.
And if they don't do that straight away, they should hang their head in shame.
Oh. Well, so presumably she's hanging her head in shame?
Well, given that she works for the ABC, who never apologise for any of their errors.
Yeah. Don't get me started on the ghost train. That was really awful. And just appalling accusations made that were not tested, because it was determined that Neville Rand and Abe Saffron, that matter, were deceased, so they wouldn't have to worry about defos. So they just surged on ahead with that nonsense, and gave, this is the worst part of it, Jack, they gave false hope to the relatives and friends of victims. That's why it's not right. To forge on ahead with these sorts of allegations, in the hope that you'll create headlines and people will watch the show, and then at the end of it, you've got all of these victims saying, "Well, what happens next?" Well, what happens next is nothing,
because no one in their right minds believed any of this.
Well, they faced a storm of protest over that, and in the end, they had an independent analyst look at it and determined that the show had made mistakes, but there were no apologies.
Well, I just think it'd be a good plan for the ABC to start putting a few mirrors in.
There's nothing wrong. Look, if you get things wrong, there's nothing wrong with publishing a correction or an apology. There's nothing wrong with it. We all make mistakes. That's why they rubbers on pencils. Not that journalists use pencils anymore, but yes, we all make mistakes. I've done it myself. I upset Kevin Rudd one time, and then Kevin Rudd, wrote letters and so forth, and I had to apologise to Kevin, and I did it. I did it willingly. I didn't enjoy it, but I did it willingly because it's just the best way to deal with these matters. Did I get it wrong? Well, I made jokes about the mental health of certain senior politicians, and that's where he came back at me pretty hard. So, happy to apologise. Happy to apologise, happy to retract.
Yeah, well, I'll just be looking forward to the next Louise Milligan ABC apology. Yeah,
Louise,
but I won't be holding my breath.
Louise did some fabulous work in Ballarat. I'll be the first to say that. Absolutely fantastic work there. Some of the stuff about Pell, because she and I both worked in that environment, at clerical abuse environment. I always steered clear of Pell as a potential offender because I thought it was irrelevant. I would get second-hand information and I'd say, look, I'm not here to talk about Pell. What actually happened in the Ballarat diocese was bad enough, just appalling stuff from clerical pedophiles. And very good arguments to be made that it was the worst sort of representation of clerical pedophilia. I always thought there was more than enough here before we went into fairly tenuous allegations against Cardinal Pell. Having said that, I do note that there are civil cases pending or before the courts at the moment that do involve George Pell, so I don't want to jump in on any of those. But my view was what is on the record was bad enough. You didn't have to do too much digging to find out that there were a whole bunch of senior priests, including Pell, who stuck their heads in the sand about what was just appalling crimes. So there you go, Jack. Happy birthday. Mm-hmm. You're going to have a drink, big dinner?
Well, we've only just come out from the infirmary from having COVID, so yeah. I will see how one of my good wife's up for dinner tonight. We might pop out somewhere just local for a quick bite.
Excellent work. Well, you have a great day, and thank you once again. And we just want to say to our listeners very, very quickly before you turn the dial, if you've liked what you've heard, please give us a review on your podcast app. But also, we would welcome some thoughts and some comments and some questions, criticisms, whatever you've got. And you can do that by hitting us up on the Conditional Release Program at gmail.com. I do have a letter from one of our listeners that we will deal with next week to deal with industrial relations, Jack, but not one of our topics for today, but we'll deal with that next week. Thank you very much for your time, and thank you, listeners, for listening to Hard Hats and High Vis.
Stay well.